Alrighty, so today's note sheet, or lesson I should say, shouldn't be that long because we are going to go over some key ideas, going to go over some strategies, and then I'm going to ask you to kind of complete the rest of the work in the worksheet on your own. Okay, so the 9.1.4 lesson is all about choosing a strategy. We now know 3 strategies that we can use to solve quadratic equations. What are those strategies? You can see them in the table. The first strategy is the zero product property. The second strategy is completing the square. And the third strategy is the quadratic formula. Okay, so we are going to go through when it is best to use these strategies. Okay, so before we get into when it's best to use these strategies, let's recall kind of the key structure or thought that we might have pop into our mind when each of these is brought about. Okay, so zero product property, we need to make sure that it is set equal to 0. Okay, but then we are thinking about using the rectangle and diamond, which then gets us, okay, to factored form, set equal to 0, and we shoot down into those mini equations, okay? Completing the square is when we have a number, we leave a space, we set it equal to that perfect square, and we have to think about what we have to add to both sides to complete the square. Okay. And then when we look at the quadratic formula, okay, we do need everything to be in standard form. But what is the quadratic formula? Once it is set equal to 0, then we know it's solving for x. We are going to say x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2 times a, and we only plug in numbers to that quadratic formula. Okay, so the question becomes, when is it best to use the strategy? Okay, so let's start with zero product property. Okay, this does not, first of all, work with all equations. I'm going to actually try to do a text box. Let's see how that works. Okay, so the first point that we need to make is this will not work for all equations. So if it doesn't factor, then you can't just give up. You have to look at using a different strategy. Okay, but in order to even attempt to use this, the equation must be equal to 0. Okay, there's no way around that. So if anything is on its own side, you need to move it with the rest of the expression. Okay, once you have it equal to 0, then zero product property is going to be used when we have nice numbers. Okay, so what are nice numbers? They need to be small, and they need to probably be whole numbers. Okay, so if you see any decimals or fractions, I would highly recommend don't even try to factor the expression. Okay, now when else would we use the quadratic equation? Or sorry, not quadratic equation, the zero product property? We're going to use it when it's already factored. Okay, if it's already in factored form, then we certainly want to take advantage of that, and we want to go ahead and just simply make our mini equations and go from there. Okay, now if these aren't true, then we need to turn to another option. Okay, so completing the square is technically can be used for every case, but I don't want to get that in your mind because sometimes it will get really messy. Okay, so with completing the square, the first time we're going to use it if something's not easily factorable. Okay, but the first key is we want to see that the coefficient on the x squared, okay, that means x squared, term is 1. Okay, if there is a number that is not 1 in front of the x squared, then you really don't want to use completing the square. I'm not going to get into detail with that, okay? But basically, unless it's a perfect square number, if you're trying to split that up to both sides of the rectangle, you have to be taking square roots. So we don't really want to completely get all messed up with that. So let's just trust that the coefficient on x squared needs to be 1 if you're really going to choose and side with completing the square. Okay, the second point that we need to make sure of is the fact that it's easier to use when the x term is an even number. Now, why is that? Because remember, with completing the square, we have to divide the x term by 2. Even numbers are divisible by 2. Odd numbers create decimals. What happens when we get decimals? We start making silly mistakes because the calculations get a little more complicated. Okay, so these are the 2 notes of when we want to side with using completing the square. Okay, now the third and final approach is the quadratic formula. And the quadratic formula we have already kind of established can be used to solve every quadratic equation. Now remember, some quadratic equations have no solution, but it will lead you to no solution, and it allows us to not have to turn to another option. So a lot of times people say, well, I'm just always going to use quadratic formula, but then they wonder how people can do some problems so quickly or basically in their head, and that's because those students know how to factor quickly and come to answers when things work out nicely. Okay, but quadratic formula, sometimes we kind of have no choice. When are we going to use that? We are going to use quadratic formula when there are decimal or fractional coefficients. When we see messy numbers, we don't need to work our minds harder than they need to work. Why don't we just go ahead and plug in like a robot into a formula and get those answers with a calculator, okay? And then also, I'm going to say large numbers, okay? Usually I'll call them large, ugly numbers. But if you see anything like, if the coefficient on x squared is 25, then you probably don't want to start multiplying that by another number and then using a rectangle diamond. Okay, it's just going to take too much time. So when you see large numbers, you are going to want to turn to using the quadratic formula. Okay, so this right here is a very important table that you want to definitely keep alongside you as you do problems with quadratics. This is in a nutshell what we've been building up to basically all the time that we've been at home, and even before spring break, believe it or not, because that was when we learned how to factor. So what you are going to do kind of by yourself at home is we are going to think about which strategy would be best to try first for each of these. So we're going to do that together as a class. But then what you are going to do is you are going to do bullet point 2 and 3, where you're going to solve the equation using the strategy we decide, and then you're going to check your solutions on that graphing calculator using the methods that I've described in the past few lessons. So check solutions on graphing calculator or Desmos.com. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the strategies that we would think might be best. Okay, so when I look at A, I see that there is a 1 on x squared and there's an even number on my x term. So some people might argue, let's do completing the square. Okay, but also in your head, you might think, well, all of those numbers are pretty nice. When I have 1 on x squared, if I think of 1 times 27, surely there's 2 numbers that multiply to be 27 but add to be 12. So the strategy I'd like you to try is either you can use complete the square. I'm going to use CS to stand for complete the square, or ZPP. Okay, either of those would work. Now, with ZPP, remember, we have to make sure that there is truly the equation is set equal to 0. Okay, now if we go to B, okay, B right away, I see a decimal. When I see that messy number, what should I turn to? The formula. quadratic formula. So on part B, you're going to try to apply that quadratic formula. Now on C, we see that what form are we already in? We are already in factored form. And what is the equation set equal to? 0. So hopefully you don't expend too much effort and work in a circle, but if you notice that it's already in factored form set equal to 0, we definitely want to use ZPP because the hard work is done for us, unlike what we're going to have to do on part A. Okay, moving right along, on part D, we first need to think about, okay, if the x term is away from the x squared term, we better get those to one side. So then if we look at x squared minus 8x plus 12 equals negative 4, yes, you could just get in the habit of always moving your units to the other side, but I'm doing this because I see that there is a 1 on the x squared. I see that my x term is even. So at this point, I can just turn to completing the square. Now, if you're thinking you might try ZPP, is it ready for ZPP yet? No, it's not. So if you are going to use ZPP, you need to make sure that your equation is set equal to 0 first. And that's fine if you'd like to go that route as well. Okay, this next one, they're kind of trying to trick us into having it not be in standard form. So we have x squared minus 2x plus 5 is going to look better. And you might say, those are nice, whole, small numbers, Miss Steffen. So let's go ahead and try ZPP. Now, I do want you to try ZPP, but don't be the person that if it doesn't factor, you just say no solution, because that's not necessarily the case. So we have to remember, if it doesn't factor, we must, that's no choice, use another tool. Okay, so in that case then, I see that my x's are even and there's a 1 in front of the x squared, so you might use completing the square or quadratic formula because it works with any case. All right, and then finally, I look right away. One, I see that this is not in standard form, but I'll let you do that on your own. But I see some pretty big numbers here, so I'm just going to jump into saying that those big numbers are going to lead me to wanting to use the quadratic formula. So, tonight, your homework is going to be to go ahead and complete let me get my highlighter. You're going to do all the problems. So you're going to do A, B. You're going to do C, D. Whoops. E and F. Okay, so you're going to actually find the solutions using the strategies that we discussed. And then after that, I would like you to consider 936 on your own. And see if you can come up with kind of what the problem is and what's going on, and then go ahead and solve it as well. Okay, so I am going to eventually post the solutions, but again, it does you no good to just copy things down without trying yourself. You're holding yourselves accountable because the learning will progress when we do get back to school from where we left off. Okay, so make sure you're keeping up with the pace. Make sure you're letting me know if you have questions. And keep motivated. You can do it. We're all in this together, and we will talk to you next time. See you later.